Thank you very much. And thank you, George. And now we will move to our next speaker. Okay. קר מדי? קרר. You want it cold or hotter? We can do it at 7. So we will go on now to Miri. Just this last summer, we watched the anti-Israeli rhetoric merge into anti-Semitic actions. To be able to deal with the words, we need to understand the media and academic framing of Israel and how it sidelines Israeli rebuttals. And there's no one better to deal with this question than Miri Eisen, who does this all the time. So Miri, come and tell us what to do.
It'll start in a minute, yeah. So, first of all, good evening, everybody. And I get to say Abe, right? Okay? My heart. I've had the opportunity to be a panelist together with Abe on more than one account. And we usually disagree. And for years, he has said that the new anti-Israel is anti-Semitism. And I disagreed for many years, and Abe knows that. And last summer, I started to agree. And I say it sadly, in a large way. I kind of didn't want to go down that way. And what I want to talk about right now is I want to talk about the words and the terms that we use as Israelis. But I'm going to take what George spoke about, I'm going to take what Abe spoke about, and I want to twist it for a moment, and I want to talk positively. But George, I'm going to do what you did. I am going to show how if you are a good guy in Europe of today, then you have to be against Israel. And I want to do that in that sense by talking about the words. All of the different things that I'm going to be showing here are from last summer. And I say that they're from last summer because I could have given it to you pretty much for the last 15 years. There has been a gradual use and a gradual misuse in this case of the way that the words themselves, that are the words that if you want to be on the good side, if you want to be on the side of justice, if you want to be on the side, and I'll show you in a few minutes the additional different words that are used, then if you're on the good side, you are against Israel. And here I want to talk for a moment, not just about the framing itself, but I want to put it into a broader sense. Over the last 15 years, and especially in Europe, and I'm focusing in Europe, and in this case, it's nice that you brought up Norway, and I'm going to broaden in. A lot of these pictures are going to be both from France and Spain and Italy, and it could have been any of the countries of Europe last summer. The demonstrations were all over. But when you looked at the words and the wording, the framing of what's shown here, look at this. Israel is not mentioned. The Palestinians are not mentioned. It isn't about the conflict, ladies and gentlemen. It's about injustice and oppressor. And I use those terms, and I'm going to go along because most of the terms that are going to be used are general terms that are used worldwide. And they fit into the place, I would call it the cultural place, that Europe is in now. And this isn't about, from my point of view, telling the Europeans you're wrong and I'm right. It's about a different cultural setting in which there are several enormous gaps between Israel 2015 and Europe, and I'm giving an enormous generalization here right now, but that's part of where we need to go. And I want to talk about where Europe is and about this type of location. Europe right now, in general, age 30 and under, okay? So sadly, most of us aren't in that group, right, okay? But George maybe is, right? But the rest of us are not in that 30 and under, are in what I am going to call a five post world. They are post-war, they are post-colonial, they are post-national, they are semi-post-religion, and they are post-Shoah. And when I say post, I am not saying that this is good and that's bad. I'm not saying we're right and they're wrong. But Israel, from the same position that I'm talking about, and again, I'm trying not to give it a grade, Israel is not post-war. We are not post-national. We don't think in ourselves of ourselves in colonial terms, okay? I'm not saying if we are or aren't, we don't necessarily think of ourselves in those terms. We are not post-religion, and we are also not post-Shoah. And when you take that combination of a cultural setting in which you're post-war. And in a post-war, in this case, it's the post-colonial, where the issue is of an oppressor. And if you can't be neutral, you have to be on the side against the oppressor. And Israel is the oppressor. Right? I'm going to go on to right. One of them will do that. When we talk about the terms themselves of being post-war, in war you have an oppressed. In war you have freedom or the oppression. And what we're talking about here is if you're on the side of the good guy, if you're on the side of the one who is against oppression and is for freedom, then you are on the free Palestine, free Gaza. I'll talk about the additional terms in a few moments, but they bite into a world where we are post-war, and it's post almost double or triple war. They're post-World War. Could you be more post-World War? I have to segue just for a moment. So I'm on a plane ride to Turkey, and it's just this last month. I went to talk to the most amazing, there's a Jewish community there, talk about amazing Jewish community, the Jewish community of Istanbul. And I'm sitting on the plane. You know how you have nothing to do when you're sitting on a plane? I forgot to bring something to read. I'm reading the Turkish Airlines magazine, right? The last thing you would think of. Ladies and gentlemen, we are in May 2015. I was there last month. Last month was 100 years to Gallipoli. Only I'm reading the Turkish Airline magazine. What was I in? 100 years to Çanakkale. Now I'm going back 13 years when, together with Major General Yadlin, we landed in Gallipoli with the National Defense College. And we suddenly realized, because we've grown up, Gallipoli, Anzac, Australia, New Zealand. Guys, there was this other side. It was called the Turks. The Turks won. Boy, do they have a different description of the battles, of what went on there. And I say that because a cultural context has to do with where you're from. It's 100 years to Çanakkale, the great Turkish victory over the Australians. It isn't about Anzac, it's about them. And when you look at it in those terms, from where they're standing right now, right from that point of view, where they are post-war, post-World War I, post-World War II, they're post-war as an idea, in the idea that everything is about discourse, everything is about dialogue. In that word, when you're talking about a military campaign, if you're talking about the way that the military is used, just from that framing, you're in a negative frame, let alone the fact of what it does when it comes to uniforms, etc. We already mentioned before the terms themselves of apartheid in that way. Again, when I'm talking about negative, I want you again to look at these different pictures because the picture itself is a positive picture. We are looking at the man who, for the world, without saying a word, is a positive figure. When you look at Mandela, and you look at it in the summer of 2014, and I look at that, I know which side I'm on. I'm on the side that supports the metamorphosis, the change that he went through, the difference that went on there, going both from the military to the non-military, that's what he represents. Going from the military to discourse, that's what he represents. And into that, adding on and in, just notice the free Palestine, the Palestine. These are all from the demonstrations this summer. And I'm asking you, if you are a person who is a thinking person, who is a positive person, who is post-war and post-national inside that world, which side are you going to be on? And I'm giving you the setting because in a moment I do want to talk about what I think we can do because of this setting, because to me the biggest challenge, first of all, is mainly within my Israeli background for people to acknowledge and understand the gap that exists in the framing itself, which if we would recognize the gap, you actually can already start both to bridge it and to address it. So you don't need to be Muslim to stand up for Gaza, you just need to be human, which means what? If you're not standing up for Gaza, you're inhuman. And you look at that, and you look at these universal human rights, and you talk about the terms that are used right now, and these are the terms that come directly into the BDS, into this campaign, into this idea, but I wanted to visualize it because I always feel that what we do inside Israel is to a certain degree, excuse me for my real literal way of putting it, we poo-poo it. And what do I mean by the way that we poo-poo it? Ladies and gentlemen, don't we all know we're right and they're wrong? And if Miri just stands up and explains it better, then they're going to get it. And I'm standing here and telling you it has nothing to do with that. It's a total aspect of framing and of setting, which makes it so challenging, because if I step in right now and I know that I'm right and they're wrong, and I talk in my military terms, in my nationalistic terms, in my Shoah terms, into a crowd which is talking in universal terms. Because you know what military, more correctly, what security is inside a European arena? Security is not about uniforms and about fighting and about battling against somebody. Security is about personal security. It's about my right as a human to live freely, to exist in the way that you saw before. That's a totally, and again, it's not that I don't have that here, only when I talk about security in Israel, most of the time, and I'm standing inside the INSS, right, okay? Most of the time when you say security in Israel, in the terms that we're talking about national security. But most of Europe nowadays is post-national. They don't view the aspect of that combination of national security as being the one together in which they view our conflict here. I add into it just a few more to give you an idea. I put this here because, George, you actually said this one before in that sense, as the one you saw in Norway, which is the one which goes up and says, I'm terrorist in my own land and I am the terrorist. And just look at the combination of words. It's using the word itself flipped against Israel. The idea that I, Israel, am the terrorist, meaning how can you call me a terror when they're the ones who came and took my land? And in that sense, it's exactly giving that correlation in the post-colonial, the post-war, that post-national, bringing it all together, all of these from the summer and all of them showing that gap in discourse, which is enormous. Now, when I put up the genocide one, and in a moment I'm going to get to the Shoah one, to me, I'm getting to the gap, which is the biggest one in the discourse, certainly with Europe, and I sadly think that it's starting to be the biggest gap everywhere else. I want to say something as my own opinion, okay? And I'm saying it as an Israeli. I think that the entire world is post-Shoah, and I don't mean that that's bad. I'm just saying they're post-Shoah, and we in Israel are not. Now just think right now about the gap in discourse that they've just added in to kindergartens in Israel, a chapter on how the kindergarten teacher is supposed to teach kindergarten 2- and 3-year-olds about Shoah. You know, we looked at it and said, what? But they have to stand in the siren. You have to tell them something. There's something that's happening around. If they don't meet it when they're 2 and 3, ladies and gentlemen, they're going to meet it when they're in 1st or 2nd grade. I have a pet fetish, which is from a different aspect, which for all of the years that this prime minister has been prime minister, meaning I've been following it from 1996, and I have followed all of his official speeches. I'm talking official speeches, the ones, you know, there's a difference when you're inside an office between the written speeches that are written that you read out and between the words that you give. Okay, I'm talking about the official speeches, the one that somebody wrote, he read before, and then he read it out. And if there is one issue that the Prime Minister of Israel has been consistent about, has been, not in the last 6 years, okay, but from 1996, has been his connection, and you alluded to this in a different way before, his connection consistently, every time he talks about Iran, in some framing, he talks about the Shoah. Okay? He can talk about the decisions made in the 1930s. He can talk about it as you guys weren't listening, all sorts of different ways, but he does it every time. Now, he, to a large degree in that sense, I say all of Israelis, you know, I was actually at a meeting last week, something in the military, because I still do miluim, I still do reserve duty. And a 35-year-old major in the Israeli military intelligence introduced himself to 8 people he'd never met before and said, I am the grandson of Shoah survivors. It was the first thing he wanted to say about himself. We're so not post-Shoah. It's so part of who we are. We talked about the first generation and the second generation and the connection between the first and the third. And we're already into the 4th generation, and it's still part of our discourse. And ladies and gentlemen, it's not like that in other places around the world. And you talk about the gap, again, in our perspective, because how can they use that? Because for us, it's a different discourse. Human rights, I mean, I'm sort of like, and I want to end with this as an allegory, which is a lovely thing, as an allegory to post-Shoah. So it's the summer of 2014. I'm sitting, downloading endless amount of disgusting pictures of anti-Israel worldwide, and you all saw this. But I want to put this into the context of what I just talked about. Because in Zara, a lovely Spanish little store, online, on August 24th, they put online this children's pajama. And when we looked at this children's pajamas on August 24th, 2014, and they started to get letters, and within 24 hours, it took them 24 hours, by the way, almost 48 hours until they took it off of the catalog. But people were like, what in the world is that? And what was written underneath was children's pajamas, Texas style. And what you can't see is that it says here, sheriff, okay? So I grew up in San Francisco and not in Texas, and it's not like, like in that sense. But I looked at this and I thought, wow. For the last month and a half, all of us have been watching the 70 years too. Bergen-Belsen and Dachau and Auschwitz. It's all been the 70 years of that. And every time they show the Holocaust survivors in their Holocaust, blue and white, striped uniforms. And I thought, really? Only in a post-Shoah Spain, where you could have a designer who's 30 and under, remember I talked about the 30s and unders, who could actually design pajamas with a star. And you know what? She probably thought, I never met her. I've been trying because I'd love to have a conversation about this, because to me, it's out of the ignorance. It's out of that aspect where you can have such a gap in discourse where she thought that reminded her of something, but to her it was about a sheriff inside pajamas. And you could actually, 70 years after the Shoah in Spain, design pajamas like this. The gaps in discourse are something that I think can be bridged. And when I say that they can be bridged, stage number one is acknowledging them. My last point is, I don't think that it's about we're right and they're wrong. And I was the spokesperson for a really long time, and probably my biggest challenge when I speak to Israelis, and I usually don't talk to Israelis, is that big gap. Because for the bulk of Israelis, even for a lot of the Jews, it's about we're right and they're wrong. If we just tell it better, then they'll get it, and we won't have things like that. I think that the discourse itself is a gap, which is a cultural gap of where we are and where the rest of the world are. And I'm not saying we have to change, or even they have to change. First, let's acknowledge the gap, and perhaps then we can start building bridges. Through what I've talked about, through the post, through what I've talked about in this little, few minutes of showing that, I find that I managed to open up an entire different discussion with people on all of the issues that we're talking about, not by telling them, you're wrong, it's about. I sit and talk about, in that sense, talking about these gaps of where we are culturally, and from there try to open up a discussion. I think that it's part of where we can go to. I certainly don't think that that's the only aspect. So I will stop with that here, and I'll leave you with my